When a struggling farmer woke up to find his entire flock of 300 sheep dead overnight, he thought he was facing a natural disaster. But when he hunted down the sinister truth hidden in the river, he uncovered a corporate secret so shocking he filed a $10 million lawsuit that would bring a terrifying conspiracy to its knees. Drop a comment with where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe to see what's coming up next. The silence was the first thing Jonathan Reed noticed, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the Clearwater Valley long before the sun had crested the eastern ridge. For 30 years, the morning rhythm of the Reed farm had been a symphony of anticipation. At 5:30 a.m., the coffee pot would hiss and gurgle in the kitchen. At 5:45 a.m., the heavy oak front door would creak on its hinges, and by 6 a.m., as Jonathan's boots crunched across the gravel driveway toward his white Chevrolet pickup, the air would be filled with the bleating of 300 Romney sheep waiting for their morning feed. It was a chaotic, hungry sound, the sound of a livelihood, the sound of a mortgage being paid 1 pound of wool at a time. But today, the air was dead. Jonathan paused with his hand on the cold metal handle of the truck. The mist was thick this morning, a white gauze that obscured the distant tree line where the property abutted the river. He zipped his tan canvas jacket higher against the chill, the fabric stiff with age and grease stains, a garment that had seen more winters than his late wife, Martha, had seen springs. "Sleepin' late?" he muttered to the empty air, though a knot of unease began to tighten in his gut. Sheep didn't sleep late, not when they knew the grain bucket was coming. He climbed into the truck, the engine turning over with a reluctant roar that seemed violently loud in the stillness. He shifted into gear and rolled slowly down the farm track, the tires crunching over loose stones. As the truck crested the small rise that overlooked the main pasture, the Green Bowl, as his father had called it, Jonathan leaned forward, squinting through the windshield which was fogging up from his own breath. He stopped the truck. He didn't put it in park. He just killed the ignition, letting the vehicle drift to a halt. Through the windshield, the scene looked like a painting gone wrong. The grass was a vibrant, impossible green, wet with dew, and scattered across it, stretching from the fence line to the riverbank, were mounds of white wool. They weren't standing. They weren't grazing. They were lying down, all of them. "No," Jonathan whispered, the words scraping out of his throat like sandpaper. "No, no, no." He shoved the door open and stumbled out. His boots sank into the soft earth as he ran, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He approached the nearest ewe, a prize breeder he'd named Bessie. She was lying on her side, legs stiff, eyes wide and staring at nothing. Her belly was bloated, tight as a drum. There was no blood. There were no throat tears from coyotes, no mangled limbs from a wolf pack. She looked as if she had simply laid down to rest and never woke up. Jonathan fell to his knees, the wet grass soaking instantly through his jeans. He placed a hand on Bessie's flank. She was cold, not just cool from the morning air, but a deep, solid cold that meant she had been gone for hours. He stood up, spinning in a slow circle. To his left, 10 ewes lay in a perfect semicircle. To his right, the rams were clustered near the feeder. The devastation was total. 300 animals, generations of breeding, the collateral for the bank loan, the future of the Reed name, all of it gone in a single night. He stood there in the center of the carnage, a lone figure in a tan jacket amidst a sea of white stillness, while the white truck sat silently on the hill behind him, a witness to the end of his world. But what Jonathan didn't know yet, as the first sob tore through his chest, was that this wasn't an act of nature. It wasn't a plague. It was a bill coming due, and he was about to find out exactly who had sent it. The vibration of his phone in his pocket felt like an intrusion from another planet. Jonathan ignored it for a long time, just standing there, unable to process the scale of the loss. When he finally pulled it out, his fingers were numb. He dialed the only number that made sense. "Sarah, you need to come out here. Now." Dr. Sarah Miller arrived 20 minutes later, her SUV fishtailing slightly in the mud as she took the turn into the pasture too fast. She was a woman of sharp angles and no-nonsense efficiency, a vet who had spent 20 years pulling calves out of mud pits and stitching up horses caught in barbed wire. But when she stepped out of her vehicle and looked across the field, she stopped dead. "My God, Jonathan," she breathed. She didn't offer condolences. She knew farmers. She knew that right now, sympathy was useless. Answers were the only currency that mattered. She grabbed her kit and snapped on blue latex gloves, the sound distinct in the quiet. "Don't touch anything else," she ordered, her voice professional but tight. "If this is contagious, we have a biohazard level event on our hands. Foot and mouth, anthrax. We need to be careful." "It's not anthrax," Jonathan said, his voice flat. "Anthrax bleeds. They're clean, Sarah. Look at them. They're just off." Sarah knelt beside Bessie. She pried open the sheep's mouth. "Cyanosis," she noted, pointing to the blue tint of the gums. "Severe oxygen deprivation, but no foaming at the mouth, no external lesions." She pulled a stethoscope from her bag, though it was a formality. She moved to the next sheep and the next. "Time of death?" Jonathan asked. He was leaning against the fender of his truck, his arms crossed tight across his chest to keep himself from shaking. "Hard to say with the cold, but rigor's fully set. I'd say 6 to 8 hours ago. Midnight, maybe 1 a.m. She stood up, peeling off the gloves with a snap. "Jonathan, this isn't a disease. A disease doesn't kill 300 animals simultaneously in a 6-hour window. Diseases travel. They pick off the weak first. This hit them all at once. Poison? Neurotoxin, maybe, or acute heavy metal poisoning, something that shut down their respiratory systems instantly." She looked at him, her eyes serious behind her glasses. "What did you change in their feed yesterday?" "Nothing," Jonathan snapped, defensive. "Same grain mix I've bought from Miller's Feed and Seed for 10 years. Same hay from the upper barn." "Water?" Jonathan gestured toward the river that lined the eastern edge of the pasture. The Blue Ridge River, a wide, meandering flow that cut through the valley. "They drink from the river. Always have." Sarah looked at the river, then back at the sheep. "I need to take tissue samples. Liver, kidney, brain tissue. We need to send these to the state lab. But Jonathan, you need to call your insurance agent, right now. If this is what I think it is, you're looking at a complete loss." A complete loss. The words hung in the mist. Jonathan walked away from her toward the riverbank. He pulled his phone out again. His hand hovered over the contact for his insurance agent, a man named Carl, usually more interested in selling him life insurance than discussing livestock policies. He made the call. It went to voicemail. "Carl, it's Jonathan Reed. They're dead. All of them. I need you to call me back. It's the whole flock." He hung up. He knew the policy. It covered fire, lightning, theft, and specific diseases. It had a clause for unexplained death, but the burden of proof was on the farmer. If he couldn't prove what killed them, The insurance company would call it negligence or act of God and wash their hands of it. He walked down to the water's edge. The river looked peaceful. The water was clear, rushing over smooth gray stones. But as he looked closer, scanning the bank where the sheep usually gathered to drink, he saw it. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, caught in the roots of an old willow tree that dipped its branches into the current. There was a foam. Not the natural white froth created by rapids, but a strange iridescent scum. It shimmered with an oily rainbow sheen, purples and greens swirling in a sickly dance. Jonathan crouched down. The vegetation along the waterline wasn't just dormant for the season, it was burnt. The grass blades were black and brittle, as if scorched by a chemical fire. "Sarah!" he yelled, not taking his eyes off the water. She trotted over, holding a sample bag. "What is it?" He pointed. "Look at the grass. Look at that foam." She squinted, then leaned in, sniffing the air. Ammonia, and something sweet, like almonds. She recoiled. "Don't touch it." "They drank this," Jonathan said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Last night, they came down for a drink and they drank this." "The current is fast here," Sarah reasoned, her scientific mind racing. "Whatever was in the water last night has mostly washed downstream by now. This foam is just residue." "Residue from what?" Jonathan demanded, standing up and scanning the river upstream. The valley was mostly farmland, woods, and... His eyes stopped on the horizon, about 4 miles upstream. Through the thinning mist, he could just make out the silhouette of a structure that hadn't been there 2 years ago. The sprawling, modern complex of Vanguard Plastics. "They said they were green," Jonathan whispered. "They said zero discharge." "You can't accuse Vanguard without proof, Jonathan," Sarah warned, following his gaze. "They employ half the town. If you go after them and you're wrong—" "I'm not wrong," he said, his voice hardening. He looked back at the field of white mounds, the silence of his farm screaming at him. "My sheep are dead, Sarah, and whatever killed them came from upstream." But proving it would require more than a hunch. It would require catching a ghost in the act. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the catastrophe for all the world to see, Jonathan realized the clock was already ticking. The evidence was washing away with every second the river flowed. The day passed in a blur of nightmare logistics. A rendering truck had to be called to collect the bodies. A grim parade of machinery that tore up the soft turf of the pasture. The driver, a man Jonathan had known since high school, couldn't even look him in the eye. The cost of the removal alone would eat up Jonathan's savings, but the bodies couldn't stay. They were toxic waste now. By evening, the farm was empty. The silence was absolute. Jonathan sat on his porch, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. The insurance agent, Carl, had finally called back. The conversation had been brief and devastating. "Without a toxicology report confirming a specific covered peril, Jonathan, I can't open a claim. And if it's groundwater contamination, well, the policy has a pollution exclusion clause. Most farm policies do. A pollution exclusion clause." Jonathan crushed the paper cup in his hand. He was looking at bankruptcy. The bank would take the farm. The land his grandfather had cleared, the house he and Martha had renovated, gone. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bessie's blue gums. At 1 a.m., the anger became too much to contain within the 4 walls of the farmhouse. He needed to know. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, the mag light that felt like a baton in his hand, and walked out to the truck. He didn't turn on the headlights. He drove by moonlight, navigating the farm roads he knew by heart. He bypassed the main road, taking an old logging trail that ran parallel to the river, moving upstream toward the Vanguard plant. He parked the truck deep in a grove of pines, about a half-mile below the factory's perimeter fence. He killed the engine and got out, the cold air biting at his face. He moved through the brush like a hunter, moving slowly, watching where he placed his boots. The river was loud here, rushing over a series of rapids. He kept his light off, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. He reached a vantage point on a bluff overlooking the river, directly across from the Vanguard facility. The factory was a hum of activity, lights blazing, steam rising from cooling towers. It looked like a city unto itself. Jonathan scanned the river bank below the factory. According to the town hall meetings when the plant was built, their water intake and output were strictly monitored. The discharge pipes were supposed to be visible, marked with safety lights and monitored by sensors. He saw the main discharge pipe. It was dry. He waited. 1:30 a.m. Nothing. 2 a.m. His legs were cramping and the cold was seeping into his bones. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was a freak algae bloom. Maybe it was a tragic accident. Then he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, just a low-frequency thrum, like a large pump engaging deep underground. It vibrated through the soles of his boots. He scanned the riverbank again. The main pipe was still dry, but about 50 yards downstream from the factory fence, in a section of the bank choked with invasive kudzu and thick brush, something moved. The brush seemed to shudder. Jonathan raised his flashlight but kept his thumb off the switch. Not yet. A metallic clank echoed over the water, a hidden mechanism. Suddenly, the water near the brush began to churn. It wasn't a trickle. It was a torrent. A massive volume of liquid was being purged into the river, hidden by the darkness and the overgrowth. Jonathan clicked the light on. The beam cut through the darkness, a white lance of accusation. It illuminated the hidden section of the bank. The kudzu had been pushed aside by the force of the flow. A rusty, unmarked pipe, maybe 2 feet in diameter, was vomiting a thick, yellowish sludge directly into the river. The steam rising from it was thick. Even from across the river, the smell hit him a moment later, that same sweet, acrid almond smell, but concentrated 1,000 times over. It burned his nostrils. "Got you," Jonathan whispered. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking not from cold, but from rage. He switched to video mode and zoomed in. The footage was grainy, but the crime was undeniable. The pipe, the sludge, the location relative to the factory. This wasn't an accident. This was a scheduled, mechanized dump of toxic waste, timed for the middle of the night when no one would be watching. The flow lasted for 10 minutes. Then, with a shudder and a gurgle, it stopped. The pipe retracted slightly, or a flap closed over it. It was hard to tell, and the brush settled back into place, concealing the metal mouth. The river rushed on, carrying the poison downstream, toward his farm, toward his sheep. Jonathan lowered the phone. He had the video. He had the sinister reason. But as he stood there in the dark, he realized something terrifying. He was one man with a cell phone against a corporation that had just dumped thousands of gallons of evidence into the Atlantic Ocean. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they had likely been doing it for months. "It's not enough." Elias Thorne threw the phone back onto his mahogany desk. He was a man who wore his cynicism like armor, a trait acquired after 30 years of practicing environmental law in a state that preferred industry to nature. He had been Jonathan's friend since varsity football, but right now he was being a lawyer. "What do you mean, it's not enough?" Jonathan demanded, pacing the small office. "You saw the video. They are dumping sludge into the river at 2 a.m. "I saw a grainy video of liquid coming out of a pipe," Elias corrected, leaning back in his chair. "A pipe that, according to the blueprints Vanguard filed with the county, doesn't exist. If we file a suit based on this, they will claim it's storm runoff. They will claim it's a drainage overflow from the parking lot. They will claim you forged the video. My sheep are dead, Elias, 300 of them. And we need to prove that specific sludge killed those specific sheep," Elias said, leaning forward. "Look, Jonathan, Vanguard Plastics is owned by a holding company in Delaware. Their legal team is bigger than the population of this town. They will bury us in motions for 5 years. Do you have 5 years of money?" Jonathan sank into the leather chair opposite the desk. "I don't have 5 months. The bank sent a notice yesterday. They're calling the loan." Elias softened. "I know. That's why we have to be smart. We need a link. Sarah is running the toxicology on the sheep?" "Yes. She said results take a week." "Good. When she finds the toxin, and she will, we need to match it to that pipe, not just a video of water. We need a sample of the actual discharge. We need to prove that what is in your sheep is exactly what is in that pipe." "You want me to go back there?" "I want us to go back there," Elias said, standing up. "I can't advocate for my client to commit trespassing, but I can certainly accompany a concerned citizen on a midnight boat ride on a public waterway to collect water samples." "It's dangerous, Elias. The smell alone. Then we wear masks. But Jonathan, listen to me. This isn't just about the sheep anymore. If they are dumping what I think they are dumping, hexavalent chromium, solvents, hardeners, that river feeds the municipal intake for the next county over. This is a public health ticking time bomb." The stakes had just shifted. It wasn't just about the farm. It was about the valley. But the opposition was moving too. When Jonathan returned home that afternoon, he found his mailbox lying in the ditch, the metal post twisted as if hit by a baseball bat. Inside the crushed box was a single envelope, no stamp. He opened it. It was a printed photo of his house, taken from the road. On the back, in block letters, "Accidents happen." He looked up at the house. It felt fragile suddenly. He thought of the empty barn. He thought of the silence. "Try me," he whispered to the empty road. The night of the sample collection was moonless, a pitch-black void that favored their mission. Jonathan and Elias launched a small aluminum flat-bottom boat 3 miles downstream and motored quietly upriver against the current. Jonathan killed the outboard engine a mile out and switched to the electric trolling motor. It was silent, pushing them through the black water like a ghost. Elias was sitting in the bow, clutching a specialized sampling pole and a cooler full of sterile glass jars. He looked ridiculous in a full-face respirator mask, but Jonathan wasn't laughing. He had his own mask on. 5 minutes to 2 a.m., Jonathan murmured, his voice muffled by the rubber seal. They drifted into the shadows of the bank opposite the factory. The plant was humming, oblivious to the 2 men floating in the dark below. "Hold steady," Elias whispered. At 2:05 a.m. the sound began, the thrumming vibration, then the clank. The pipe emerged from the brush like the cannon of a battleship. "Here it comes," Jonathan warned. The sludge hit the water with a hiss. The river around the pipe instantly turned turbulent and opaque. "Get closer," Elias urged. If I get too close, the current will slam us into the bank, Jonathan argued, but he steered the boat into the edge of the discharge plume. The smell penetrated even the charcoal filters of their masks. It was a chemical assault. Elias extended the pole, dipping the jar directly into the yellow froth spewing from the pipe. "Got it," Elias said, capping the jar and swapping it for another. "Get 2 more. We need redundancy." Suddenly, a spotlight swept across the water. "Freeze," Jonathan hissed. The beam originated from the factory fence line. A security guard was walking the perimeter, sweeping the river with a high-powered torch. The light passed over their boat. They were low in the water, painted matte green, hidden partially by the overhanging branches of the opposite bank. But if the guard looked closely, the light swept back. It paused on a ripple in the water where the trolling motor had cut the surface. Jonathan held his breath. His hand drifted to the ignition key of the big outboard. If they were spotted, they would have to run, and running would mean explaining why they were fleeing the scene. The guard shouted something into a radio. The light held steady. Then, a splash nearby, a beaver slapping its tail on the water, broke the tension. The guard seemed to accept this as the source of the disturbance. The light moved on. "Go," Elias breathed. "Now. Drift back. Don't start the engine until we're around the bend." They drifted silently downstream, the precious cargo of toxic sludge gurgling in the cooler between them. They had the bullet. Now they just needed the gun. The meeting with Vanguard Plastics was not a negotiation, it was an ambush. 3 days after the sample collection, Sarah's results came back. Acute toxicity, hexavalent chromium and trichloroethylene, a deadly cocktail used in industrial plating and plastic hardening. The samples from the pipe, a perfect chemical match, 99.9% correlation. Elias filed the lawsuit the next morning. Reed v. Vanguard Plastics. Damages sought, $10 million. The response was immediate. Vanguard requested a preliminary deposition. They wanted to size up the farmer who dared to punch a giant. The conference room in the city was glass and steel, a stark contrast to Jonathan's muddy boots and flannel shirt. He sat at the long table, Elias beside him. Across from them sat 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than Jonathan's truck, and Gavin Rost, the plant manager. Rost was a man who smiled with his mouth, but not his eyes. He looked bored. "Mr. Reed," the lead lawyer began, opening a file. "We understand you've suffered a loss. Livestock farming is a difficult business. Diseases, parasites, bad feed." "It wasn't the feed," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "So you claim. But let's look at the facts. You are deeply in debt. Your farm is failing. And suddenly, your entire flock dies, and you see this as a lottery ticket." "I see it as murder," Jonathan said. Rost chuckled. "Murder? They're sheep, Mr. Reed. And frankly, your accusations are defamatory. We have strict environmental protocols. We filter every drop of water that leaves our plant." "Then explain the pipe," Elias said, sliding a photo across the table. It was a still from the video. Rost didn't blink. That's an old storm drain. It hasn't been active in 20 years. If water came out of it, it was likely heavy rain accumulation." "It hadn't rained in 2 weeks," Jonathan cut in. "And," Elias added, placing the toxicology report on top of the photo, "we have samples. The water coming out of that storm drain contained 500 times the legal limit of hexavalent chromium, the exact same chemical found in Mr. Reed's dead sheep." The lawyers stiffened. Rost stopped smiling. "You trespassed," the lead lawyer snapped. "Any samples collected illegally are inadmissible." "Actually," Elias smiled, The Blue Ridge River is a navigable public waterway. We never touched your land. We collected the sample from the river. It's public domain. And since you claim that pipe is just a storm drain, you shouldn't be worried about what's in it, right? Rost leaned forward. You're playing a dangerous game, Reed. You think you can bleed us? We will bury you in litigation. We will drag this out until your grandkids are paying off your legal fees. Drop the suit. We'll give you a settlement for the market value of the sheep, $50,000. Take it and go away. $50,000. It wouldn't even cover the cleanup. Jonathan looked at Rost. He thought of the dead silence of the meadow. He thought of the iridescent foam. He thought of the brick through his window. No, Jonathan said. I don't want your hush money. I want you to stop. Then you get nothing, Rost sneered. The weeks that followed were a war of attrition. Vanguard made good on their threat. They filed motions to dismiss. They attacked Sarah's credentials. They hired PR firms to paint Jonathan as an eco-terrorist looking for a payout. The town turned on him. The local diner, where Jonathan had eaten breakfast every Sunday for 20 years, suddenly didn't have a table for him. You're closing the plant, Jonathan, the owner whispered to him. My nephew works there. If they shut down, this town dies. If they don't shut down, Jonathan replied, this town gets poisoned. He was isolated, alone. The bank foreclosure date was looming. He sat in his dark house, watching the headlights of cars passing slowly by, wondering if tonight was the night they would do more than throw a brick. But the cracks in Vanguard's armor were starting to show. The turning point came in the form of a man named Miller. He was a shift supervisor at Vanguard, a man Jonathan had seen around town but never spoken to. Miller met them in the back of the library, away from prying eyes. He looked terrified. Rost is lying, Miller said, his hands shaking as he held a coffee cup. The filtration system. The membrane scrubbers broke 6 months ago. To replace them means shutting down the line for 3 weeks. That's millions in lost production. Rost ordered a bypass. Can you prove it? Elias asked. I have the maintenance logs, Miller said. He slid a thumb drive across the table. Digital copies. They tried to delete the originals, but I backed them up. It shows the dates the bypass was engaged. Every night, 2 a.m. to 2:15 a.m. Jonathan looked at the drive. Why are you doing this? You'll lose your job. Miller looked at Jonathan. I live downstream too, Mr. Reed. My kids swim in that river in the summer. When I heard about your sheep, I realized my kids are next. The final hearing was anticlimactic in its brevity. Elias walked into the courtroom, not with a briefcase of arguments, but with the thumb drive. He presented the logs to the judge and Vanguard's defense team in a pre-trial disclosure. The timestamps on the bypass logs matched the timestamp on Jonathan's video. Perfectly, it matched the time of death of the sheep. It was the smoking gun. Not just negligence, but criminal intent, willful poisoning of a waterway to save money. The defense team went pale. They asked for a recess. 10 minutes later, they returned. There would be no trial. They are folding, Elias whispered to Jonathan, barely concealing his grin. They can't let those logs go into public record in a criminal trial. The EPA would shut them down permanently. The executives would go to jail. The settlement offer was revised. $10 million, plus full remediation of Jonathan's land, installation of a new state-monitored filtration system at the plant, and a public admission of the mechanical failure. A face-saving lie, but an admission nonetheless. Do we take it? Elias asked. Jonathan looked at the Vanguard lawyers. They looked defeated. He looked at Rost, who was staring at the floor, knowing his career was over. "We take it," Jonathan said, "but I want one more thing. I want Rost fired, today." The lawyers nodded. It was done. 1 year later. The mist was lifting off the green bowl. The air was cool and crisp. Jonathan walked out to the white truck. It was clean, the rust spots fixed, the engine tuned. He wore a new jacket, though he kept the old tan one in the closet as a reminder. He drove to the top of the rise and killed the engine. The pasture was green. The scars of the toxic burn had healed, thanks to months of soil replacement and treatment paid for by Vanguard. And there, scattered across the grass, were 50 new lambs. They were lively, bouncing and chasing each other, their bleats filling the air with the chaotic music of life. Jonathan stepped out of the truck. He breathed in the air. It smelled like damp earth and grass, no almonds, no chemicals. He walked down to the river. The water was crystal clear. The willow tree was putting out new shoots. He had paid off the farm. He had set up a trust for the town to monitor the water quality independently. He had saved the valley. But as he watched the river flow, he didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like a farmer who had done his job. "Morning, girls," he called out to the flock. The sheep looked up, ears twitching. They were alive. They were safe. Jonathan Reed tipped his cap to the river, climbed back into his truck, and drove back to the house. The silence was gone, and it wasn't coming back.